Imagine this. You're a woman, married, miserably. And then, surprise, your husband marches you to the town square, puts a rope around your neck like you're a prize sheep and sells you to the highest bidder. Nope, this isn't a weird Monty Python sketch. It actually happened, often. So before we unpack this true horror story of marriage, misery and marketplace transactions, do me a favour, hit that like button if you enjoy these darker dives into history, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable. Let's get one thing straight before we romanticise the 1800s with their lace bonnets, candlelit parlours and slow-motion hand touches. Being married in Victorian England was, for a lot of people, especially women, the social equivalent of being handed a pair of iron cuffs and a polite smile. You said, "I do," and then promptly vanished into the background of your husband's legal identity, like a decorative wall sconce that made stew and birthed heirs. Now, I know what you might be picturing. Maybe you're thinking of that slow burn, tortured pining kind of love in a Jane Austen novel. Two people exchanging longing glances over tea and slowly realising they've been in love all along. Nope. Real Victorian marriage wasn't candlelit ballrooms and whispered sonnets. It was more like a grim merger between a man, a woman and a property contract. Except the woman was the property. And if you were a woman? Congratulations, you just legally ceased to exist. I'm not being dramatic, that's literally how the law worked. As soon as you got married, your legal identity was absorbed into your husband's like a drop of ink vanishing into a bucket of water. You couldn't vote. You couldn't own land. You couldn't even keep the wages you earned if, by some miracle, you found work. Legally, you were as relevant as a fireplace poker. Useful, expected to take the heat, and completely owned. To make matters worse, if your husband happened to be a raging alcoholic, a chronic gambler, or just a garden variety jerk, well, tough luck. There was no easy way out. Divorce existed, technically, but it was about as accessible to the average person as a ticket to the moon. For a man, getting a divorce was expensive, scandalous, and required the equivalent of legal gymnastics. For a woman, it was near impossible unless you were both wealthy and could prove extreme cruelty, incest, or desertion. And even then, you might be laughed out of court or worse, lose your children, home, and whatever shred of reputation you had left. So there you are, stuck in a loveless and possibly dangerous marriage, the walls of your little Victorian cottage closing in like a corset 2 sizes too small. Your husband controls everything. Your money, your children, your access to society. You can't even leave the house without risking your reputation. And even if you did try to flee, guess what? Your husband could legally drag you back like a misplaced teacup. Because you, dear wife, were considered part of the household inventory. Now let's flip this around for the fellas. Suppose you're a Victorian husband. You got married young, you're poor, and you're miserable. You and your wife fight constantly. Maybe she's just as fed up as you are. Divorce? Not happening. You're a blacksmith or a coal miner. Your savings are stored under your mattress in the form of 1 sad coin and a half-eaten biscuit. You can't afford lawyers, and the idea of dragging your domestic dirty laundry into the public eye makes you sweat through your waistcoat. What do? You look at your wife. She looks at you. And maybe, just maybe, you both realise the same thing. There's one terrible, humiliating, questionably legal way out of this. And it involves a rope, a market, and a public announcement. Yes, folks, this is the societal pressure cooker that gave birth to the grim tradition of wife selling. It sounds utterly insane now, and, well, it was. But back then, the working class was a desperate attempt to take back a shred of autonomy in a system that offered none. You couldn't get divorced, but if you were poor and crafty and didn't mind making a public spectacle of your disintegrating marriage, you could do what others had done before. Auction off your spouse. Let's leave the general horror behind for a moment and zoom in on one particular case. One that isn't just a rumour or whispered legend, but fully documented and dripping with the kind of bleak absurdity that makes you want to close your history book and go touch grass. Meet Samuel Whitehouse. No relation to the White House. You'll soon realise he's the polar opposite of anything presidential. Samuel was an ordinary man from Wolverhampton, a modest industrial town in England known for ironwork, coal mining, and, apparently, the occasional human auction. It was 1832, the kind of year where Britain was reeling from political unrest, economic pressure, and the collective smell of too many people packed into too little space. Amid this chaos, our friend Samuel decided he'd had quite enough of his marital commitments. Divorce? Too expensive. Legal separation? Not even worth considering. Counselling? That wasn't even a word in the average 1830s vocabulary, unless it ended in clep for debt. So, what did Sam do? He took his wife, who to her credit reportedly went along with it, and led her to the local market. No hiding, no shame, just full-on ropes and all public spectacle. He marched her right through the crowd like he was delivering a pig to slaughter. She, bless her, wore a bonnet and kept her chin up. Maybe she thought this was the start of something new. Or maybe she'd just emotionally checked out weeks ago. Either way, she was about to become part of a disturbingly popular working-class ritual. Samuel stood her up on the auction block, literally, not metaphorically, and announced she was for sale. Now, if you're imagining some kind of formal setup with scales and auction paddles, dial it back. This was not Sotheby's. This was a grubby wooden crate in a crowded market surrounded by onlookers with beer on their breath and mud on their boots. And what, you might ask, did Samuel demand for his flesh and blood wife? A carriage? A cow? A nice pair of shoes? No. He sold her for a pint of beer. Let that sink in. 1 pint of beer. Not even a pitcher. Not even the premium stuff. Just one warm, foamy tankard of whatever passed for beer in a town where the water was barely drinkable. And the buyer? A man she reportedly preferred, which only makes the whole thing feel more like a really dark comedy skit. The crowd laughed. Coins may or may not have changed hands. The pint was likely drunk on the spot. And just like that, the transaction was done. Wife sold, Samuel was free. His former wife walked off with her new owner, and the world kept turning. Now, you might expect some fallout. Some sort of punishment. A scandal. A firm hand of justice slapping Samuel on the wrist and saying, "Absolutely not, young man." But this is Victorian England, the land of fog, formality, and baffling moral flexibility. When word got around, and it did because humans love a public scandal, the authorities decided to do the bare minimum. Samuel Whitehouse was brought before a magistrate. His defence? He didn't know it was illegal. And you know what? He might have been telling the truth. At the time, with wife selling tolerated in some communities and occasionally even facilitated by public officials, Samuel may have genuinely thought he was doing everything above board. After all, he conducted the sale in public, there were witnesses, and nobody objected, not even his wife. So what was his punishment? 10 shillings, that's it. The price of a decent lunch and maybe a clean handkerchief. A literal slap on the wrist and a don't do that again level of legal rebuke. No prison, no public apology, no social exile. Just 10 shillings and presumably a hearty burp from the buyer finishing the beer. This case, as ridiculous as it sounds, is actually one of the most cited examples in historical accounts of wife selling. Not because it was the most dramatic. There were cases involving fights, riots, and women being sold multiple times like cursed collectibles, but because it perfectly illustrates the bizarre legal limbo of the practice. A man publicly sells his wife like she's a second-hand umbrella. She agrees, the buyer agrees, everyone claps, and the legal system shrugs like, well, what can you do? What's disturbing isn't just the sale itself, it's the attitude surrounding it. This wasn't treated like a scandal so much as a local curiosity, a quirky village tale. You can almost hear the tavern chatter that night. Did you hear about Whitehouse selling his missus for a pint? Cheapest divorce I've ever seen. Followed by uproarious laughter and a chorus of tankards hitting tables. It reveals something deeply unsettling about the way society viewed women at the time. Not as people with agency and rights, but as burdens to be passed around, bartered over, and disposed of when no longer convenient. Even in this case, where the wife supposedly consented, we have to ask, what choice did she really have? Agreeing to be sold may have been the lesser evil in a life with no good options. If your choices are poverty, abuse, or public humiliation with the chance of a slightly better future, it's not really freedom, it's survival. The Samuel Whitehouse story also underscores how the line between legal and illegal was murkier than the Thames on a foggy day. If the community accepted it, if no one protested, if the wife didn't scream bloody murder, then everyone kind of went along with it. The law wasn't just written in books, it was scrawled in the dirt of the marketplace, negotiated between common folk and customs, and enforced or ignored by men with wigs and very questionable priorities. And so, Samuel got off with a fine, The woman got a new man, and the town got a story to dine out on for decades. Meanwhile, historians centuries later are left blinking at the dusty court records, trying to decide whether to laugh, cry, or throw the whole century in the bin. This one case might seem like an outlier, but it wasn't. It was typical, and that's what makes it chilling. Because when something this outrageous becomes routine, it means the system isn't broken, it's working exactly as intended. A system built on imbalance, inequality, and a heavy helping of casual cruelty, wrapped in normalcy, covered in laughter. So the next time you think you're having a rough breakup, just remember, at least no one's trying to trade you for a lukewarm beer and a handshake. Let's address the elephant in the mud-covered Victorian market. Were these women being forced to be sold? Or were they, brace yourself, choosing it? This is where things get complicated. Because as horrific as it sounds to be led by a rope through a drunken crowd and shouted over like a side of bacon, the unsettling truth is, sometimes the wife agreed. Not always, not joyfully, but often enough that we can't ignore it. Because when you have no legal rights, no income, no protection under the law, and your husband smells like boiled socks and yells about demons in the wallpaper, being sold might have actually seemed like an upgrade. Let's be clear, this was not empowerment. Nobody was slapping on eyeliner and saying, "I'm doing this for me." But when your choices are 1, stay with a man who beats you and treats you like luggage, or 2, be sold to another man who's at least slightly less violent and maybe owns a second blanket, well, that's not a choice. That's a survival strategy dressed up as free will. And yes, there are stories of women who celebrated their departure. One woman reportedly shouted "good riddance to bad rubbish" as her husband handed over the rope, then marched off into the sunset with her new man, probably humming with more joy than she'd felt in years. Others laughed, cracked jokes, or even negotiated the sale themselves. Imagine standing beside your soon-to-be former husband, while he tries to talk you down to 5 shillings, and you're behind him yelling, "At least ask for 10, you cheap bastard." Some women even insisted on being auctioned, not because they wanted to participate in some bizarre domestic ritual, but because they knew the courts weren't going to help them. The church wouldn't help them. Their neighbours wouldn't step in. So they seized the only avenue that offered a tiny flicker of hope, and walked through it with whatever dignity they could scrape together. And if that meant being led like a sheep past the pig pens and the ale cart, then so be it. But don't mistake grit for freedom. Just because someone survives a terrible situation with a sense of humour doesn't mean they're okay with it. The women who agreed to these sales weren't liberated. They were trapped, and this was their version of picking the lock with a spoon. It was pragmatic desperation. It was agency within the cruel boundaries of a system that didn't even recognise their right to say no. Think about the broader context. Under English law at the time, women were basically legal shadows. Married women had no right to their own property, no legal control over their children, and no ability to initiate divorce unless they could afford years of court fees, public hearings, and an airtight case involving either adultery or something outrageous like incest. And if she did somehow pull that off, the court often gave custody of the children to the husband anyway, because clearly the man who sold his wife for beer is also the ideal role model for child-rearing. So if a woman saw a chance, however humiliating, however grim, to trade one hopeless situation for a slightly better one, it's not surprising she might take it. Some women were sold to men they already had relationships with. Lovers, friends, sympathetic neighbours who offered a way out. Others just crossed their fingers and hoped the new man had at least heard of soap and didn't believe in ghosts living in the kettle. And some probably didn't care either way. They were simply done. Done being beaten, ignored, worked to the bone and told they were worthless. Done waking up in a life that felt like a sentence with no appeal. When a system backs you into a corner, walking into a public market with a rope around your waist starts to look like a jailbreak. Still, we can't pretend this always went smoothly. There were plenty of cases where the wife didn't want to be sold, where the crowd turned ugly, or the new owner was worse than the old one, where women were paraded in front of jeering drunks, groped, insulted, spat on. The humiliation was real, and often lifelong. In some towns, a wife sale would stick to a woman's reputation like chimney soot. No matter how decent her new marriage was, she'd always be the one who got sold like a sheep. That kind of public shame doesn't wash off. And the crowds? Oh, the crowds. These weren't solemn transactions conducted in quiet corners. They were often loud, leering, and gleefully entertained. People gathered like it was cheap theatre. Kids watched. Men placed mock bids. There was laughter, catcalling, sometimes even betting. It was like watching a reality show, except the prize was a traumatised woman and the setting was a cart full of potatoes. So while we may read about voluntary sales, we have to ask, how voluntary is anything when you're poor, powerless and considered property? It's easy to look back and think, well, at least she wanted it. But wanting something less awful isn't the same as wanting it. No woman wanted to be sold, she just wanted out. And this was the one way out that didn't require lawyers, years of courtroom drama, or the approval of a system that had never listened to her voice in the first place. In some twisted way, the wife sale exposed the hypocrisy of Victorian values. A society that claimed to be moral, God-fearing and orderly had created a world so rigid and unkind that people had to barter their relationships in the dirt just to escape them. Men weren't selling their wives because they were monsters. They were doing it because they had no other option, and the law made sure of that. And women weren't agreeing because they loved the attention. They were doing it because the alternative was silence, suffering, or starvation. It's tempting to turn these stories into jokes. Can you believe this guy sold his wife for a jug of cider? She left her husband for a man with better boots. And sure, there is dark comedy in the absurdity of it all, but beneath the laughs is something much sadder. A society that failed its people so thoroughly that even the most basic human need, to leave an unhappy relationship, had to be handled with ropes and public humiliation. So was it choice? Technically, was it freedom? Not even close. These women weren't exercising liberation. They were manoeuvring inside a cage, feeling for the one loose bar. And sometimes that bar looked like a public auction, a crowd of strangers, and the distant hope that the next man would hurt less than the last. That's not empowerment. That's desperation dressed in resignation. You'd think that after decades of people publicly selling their wives next to onions and oxen, the British legal system might have said, you know what, maybe we should stop letting people treat their marriages like meat raffles. But as with all things Victorian, progress came not with a bang but with a tired sigh, a few sneezes and a reluctant shuffle of paper across a dusty desk. It took a while, an embarrassing amount of time actually, despite the sheer weirdness, and let's be honest, outright barbarity of wife selling. It managed to hang around like a bad smell for well over a century. From the early 1700s to the late 1800s, the practice stubbornly lingered in pockets of British society, especially among the working class, where desperation often outpaced decorum. And while newspapers increasingly covered these events with mocking horror, and middle-class Victorians clutched their pearls at the very idea, the law itself just kind of blinked. Why the delay? Simple. The people who made the laws, wealthy, male, and comfortably removed from the realities of coal-dusted markets and ale-soaked taverns, didn't have to worry about finding creative ways to escape a loveless marriage. They had access to actual divorce courts, lawyers, and private scandals neatly swept under the rug. They didn't need to tie a halter around their wife and bargain her away like a second-hand accordion. That kind of desperation didn't exist in the drawing room. So the state did what it often does when uncomfortable truths bubble up from the lower classes. It looked away. Sure, from time to time, some poor bloke got fined or scolded for the indecency of it all. But those were slap-on-the-wrist moments, more about maintaining public order than protecting women's rights. After all, many of these sales were consensual in the eyes of the community. And if no one raised a fuss, if the wife seemed content to move on and the new husband paid his shillings or pint of beer, well, what was there to prosecute? It wasn't until much later that the law finally stiffened its upper lip and said, all right, this has gone on long enough. The slow death of wife selling was tied directly to the slow birth of modern marriage reform, which, fittingly, came in a flurry of dry-sounding laws that might make your eyes glaze over, but quite literally changed the game for women in Britain. The first major turning point was the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, and while that sounds like something you'd use to lull a toddler to sleep, it was actually revolutionary. For the first time, ordinary people, not just the rich and titled, could access civil divorce courts. Divorce was no longer a matter for Parliament, but could be handled like any other legal dispute. Granted, it was still wildly unfair. Men could divorce for adultery, women had to prove adultery and cruelty or desertion. But it was something, a crack in the iron cage. With legal divorce now technically available, the wife-selling workaround started to lose its perverse charm. People could still try to sell their spouses, of course, and some did, but it increasingly became the stuff of scandal rather than solution. The Victorian press began covering these events less like quirky folklore and more like grotesque relics of an ignorant past. Judges who once turned a blind eye began using stronger language in court. Words like disgraceful, degrading, and a practice most revolting to Christian sensibilities started making their way into legal rulings. Still, the final nail in the coffin took decades more to hammer in, because let's be honest, cultural habits die hard, especially when they're tangled up with economic desperation and toxic gender norms. In the most remote and poverty-stricken areas of England, wife sales still popped up occasionally, even into the early 20th century. The last reported case occurred in 1926. That's not a typo. 1926. That's the same year Winnie the Pooh was published. Imagine flipping through your newspaper, reading about a bear with a balloon and right below it, a story about a woman being sold by her husband in a pub yard. But by the 20th century, wife-selling had become less about community-accepted ritual and more about drunken absurdity. Public tolerance had evaporated. These events were no longer alternative divorce. They were low-class, grotesque spectacles that brought police, not applause. Law enforcement was finally cracking down, and courts were no longer buying the "we didn't know it was illegal" defence. Why? Because by this point, women had started gaining actual legal rights. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 gave married women control over their earnings and property, finally making them actual people in the eyes of the law. These acts were game changers. For the first time in centuries, a married woman wasn't just a decorative surname sponge attached to her husband's assets. She could own property, keep her wages, sue someone in court. She didn't need to be transferred from one man to another like a warm kettle. Add to that the slow march of women's suffrage, the rise of feminism, and the changing public attitude toward marriage, and wife-selling began to feel like a shameful hangover from a time everyone wanted to forget. A symbolic embarrassment. The British Empire, for all its pomp and self-congratulation, couldn't exactly pat itself on the back for bringing civilization to the world, while its own citizens were literally auctioning each other off behind pubs. So the courts caught up, the cops caught up, society caught up. Sort of. Because even after wife-selling became taboo, even after it was criminalised in effect if not by name, its legacy lingered. The language of ownership in marriage didn't go away overnight. Women still had to fight for custody of their children, for the right to leave without being shamed, for the right to not be blamed if a man turned violent. The rope might have disappeared, but the control didn't. It just got better manners. And so, what started as a desperate workaround, a grim joke at the expense of human dignity, eventually collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity. Not because the law suddenly became enlightened, but because people, especially women, pushed and pushed until the system was forced to evolve. Slowly, begrudgingly, with a lot of dusty wigs and red tape. But evolve it did. By the time wife-selling truly died out, it wasn't with a law or a declaration. It was with public shame, with side eyes, with, "Wait, didn't someone's uncle do that once?" It faded like a bad habit people stop admitting to, and in its place came a new idea that maybe, just maybe, marriage shouldn't feel like ownership. That maybe people, both women and men, deserved better than bartering each other for beer. We still joke about marriage being a ball and chain, about nagging wives and clueless husbands, but at least now, when someone wants out of a relationship, they don't have to find a rope, a crate and a willing crowd. They just leave. And if that's not progress, I don't know what is. So, After trudging through the muddy markets, the halters, the pints of beer and the bizarre public transactions, you might be wondering, what's the takeaway here? What do we do with the knowledge that for over a century British men were literally selling their wives like farm tools? Is it just a weird footnote in history? A darkly funny anecdote to break out at dinner parties? Or is it something deeper? The truth is, wife selling isn't just about the past. It's about power, desperation, and the way societies bend under pressure. It's about what people do when the system is stacked against them, when the rules are written for the wealthy, when the law is out of reach, and when human beings are forced to find loopholes in order to survive. It's easy to laugh at the absurdity of it all, at the guy who traded his wife for a jug of ale, or the woman who shouted "good riddance" as she walked off with her new man. But underneath the comedy is a much darker truth. People didn't do this because they wanted to. They did it because they had to. This strange, sad chapter in history is a mirror. It reflects what happens when people are reduced to property, when gender becomes a cage and poverty tightens the bars, when marriage isn't about partnership but possession. And even though we live in a very different world now, where marriage laws are more equal, divorce is accessible, and people, thankfully, aren't being sold between market stalls, the echoes are still there. We still inherit the language of ownership in relationships. We still see gender roles that echo the old hierarchies, and in some corners of the world, forced marriage, child marriage, and economic coercion are still happening. Wife selling may be dead in Victorian England, but its shadow stretches long. But here's the thing. History isn't meant to make us comfortable. It's meant to jolt us, to remind us of how far we've come, yes, but also how fragile progress can be. The fact that this happened at all should stick with us, because it didn't happen in secret. It wasn't rare. It was normal. It was ordinary. And that's the most chilling part. So maybe the next time we hear someone say, history was better back then, we ask, better for who? Because for the women with ropes around their waists and no choices in their hands, back then was a nightmare dressed up as tradition. And now you know the horrific reason why Victorian men sold their wives, not because they were monsters, but because the world they lived in gave them no other way out. So, yeah, maybe pour yourself something stronger than tea tonight. And remember, never trust a man with a rope and a pint.